Okay. So, dear tram friends, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, good morning, good afternoon. I'm glad to welcome you to another appointment in this cycle of international video conferences dedicated to tramways and other means of transport. Today's presentation will be made by Jim Schantz, chairman of the Seashore Trolley Museum in Kennebunkport, Maine, USA. This presentation will be done in English. At the end of the evening, there will be a space for any questions in English or in Italian, and you can also use the chat in every moment during the presentation. The program of the forthcoming presentation for the first part of 2025 will be available in a few days on our internet site. Anyway, the next one is already scheduled for Tuesday, January 28th, and it will deal with tramways in Upper Silesia, Poland. Thank you. Now, before giving the floor to James Schantz, I have to repeat everything in Italian. Cari amici dei tram, signore e signori, buonasera e benvenuti a un nuovo appuntamento in questo ciclo di videoconferenze internazionali dedicate ai tram e agli altri mezzi di trasporto. Questa sera abbiamo un collegamento dagli Stati Uniti d'America. James Schantz, che è il presidente della Seashore Trolley Museum a Kennebunkport nel Maine, ci presenterà la sua realtà, il suo museo. La presentazione sarà fatta in inglese. Alla fine della serata ci sarà spazio per domande in inglese o in italiano, ma potete utilizzare la chat in ogni momento durante la presentazione. Il programma delle prossime presentazioni per la prima parte del 2025 sarà disponibile tra qualche giorno sul nostro sito internet, ma nel frattempo il primo appuntamento dopo la pausa natalizia sarà martedì 28 gennaio con una presentazione sugli tram della Slesia, quindi la regione di Katowice in Polonia. Grazie e ora passo la parola a James Schantz. Now the floor goes to James Schantz.
Deve attivare il video.
Please, James, you have to share your screen. Okay.
Well, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, and thank you for having me. I'm certainly pleased to have an opportunity to see you all and to tell you a little bit about our museum. Who am I? Just to get it out, I've been a volunteer at the Seashore Trolley Museum for 62 years, believe it or not. It's been quite a long time, a lifetime achievement. And I serve as the president and chief executive officer now, and have been for some time. In my background, I volunteered in restoration. That was really my first love, if you will. Fundraising, publishing, administration are other things I have done. And by the way, can people hear me? Am I speaking loudly enough?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, good. I'm a member of the American Public Transit Association Streetcar Committee. In fact, a founding member, we did that. That's trying to support the bringing back of heritage streetcars and modern streetcars throughout the U.S. and Canada. And we've been doing guidelines and things of that nature, standards for the industry. I'm a member of the Community Streetcar Coalition, which is another group that's working on funding for streetcar lines. And in my travels in the years and living overseas, I've seen more than 160 streetcar and light rail systems around the world. Now, our museum, which is what you really want to hear about, was founded in 1939 to save Biddeford and Saco 31. I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. We believe that in 1939, when those group of about 10 men bought this car and took it to a location, that it's the first time that a bunch of volunteers had ever taken a tram car to be preserved for future generations to see it. And as it was the first trolley museum, then at least in North America, if not elsewhere, And this is our 85th anniversary, which we've been celebrating this year. So it's quite a long time. It's a strange name, but that's where we are, located in Kennebunkport, Maine. And it's something that's pretty much true for all of our rail museums in the US. All the funding comes from donations of visitors. Very, very seldom do we get any money from government sources. So we began offering rides in 1953. That's when there first was enough track and wire to do that. But the location of the museum, just by coincidence, when Biddeford and Saco 31 became available, the mayor of the Biddeford said, you can have that car, but you need to get it out of here pronto, get it out of here fast. And found a location after they looked at it. It just so happened that it was on the right-of-way of a former trolley line that had been abandoned about 10 years earlier. So we've been putting track back on that and have about a 2.4 kilometers that we use currently. We have a paid staff of 14 people, 525 volunteers of all types. Excuse me, and 870 members in the society itself. And our attendance by the public is running around 38,500 this year. And our season is from May until December. We're typically are open 5 days a week. And over the years, what we did is build a national collection of American streetcars, as we call it, which encompasses some 230 cars. The historical philosophers in our organization felt that the streetcar industry was so important and it was so large in so many different cities, and the cars were customized to the needs of the city in many cases, to preserve as many of these different important cities and types of cars and get them from all over. So ours is the most, not only the largest, but the most diverse collection in the United States of trims. Now here's a map of the US, and where we are is way up in this corner up here. You can see that this is the state of Maine. New Hampshire's over here, and we are on the seacoast, close to the seacoast, about 6 kilometers from the actual water in Kennebunkport, Maine. Now you'll notice that we're about Massachusetts and Boston is, get my pointer back here, is down here. So we're about 120 kilometers from Boston, and we have a lot of materials over that come from Boston. It's the closest big city. Montreal, you can see, is north of us, and Toronto is west. New York, Philadelphia, and other big traction cities all down the eastern seaboard. Now there it is. That's the car that started it all. This is Biddeford and Saco Railroad 31. Biddeford and Saco are two little towns north of us, a few miles. A city, Biddeford, a mill city, and Saco as well as another mill city on the ocean. Meaning they made fabrics and things like that. And Old Orchard Beach was a recreational location that was some miles away, and the streetcar line was built to go from Old Orchard Beach, which is where this car is pictured, into Biddeford at the other end and connecting to lines to other locations. But in 1939, that car, as you look at it, was already an antique. It dates back to about 1901, but there it was still going in then, and there it is still going now at our museum. It's called a 12-bunch open car built by the J.G. Brill Company, which I think most of you would recognize as the most important car builder in the U.S. Now this is a view at our museum. This large building is our visitor center, welcoming center. On the left side of it here is a large exhibit and an event area inside. Over here is the museum store inside, and on the upper level are offices and meeting facilities for internal use. Our cars operate on this track. As you see, this car coming in, going around, and picking up passengers here and go back out. We can use either single end or double end cars to do it. There's another view from above. That's just by point of information. That is a Boston 25-foot car, so that's about 35 meters. Actually, that's not quite right. about 7 meters length. And they were called 25-foot box cars in Boston. But the reason I mentioned it is Boston once had 1,300 of those, 1,300. It's amazing the size of that, and that's the only one that's left. Another view of the visitor center with one of the Connecticut cars. I'll mention a few words about those coming. And this is an aerial view the other way. The entrance is behind the camera. The entrance road comes up to the visitor center you see on the right. And this building is a new car barn we just built. I'm going to say a few more words about it. We have another building there. This one up at the top is our restoration shop, and I'll have some more about that. And there's 3 more large buildings back here to protect the cars, but unfortunately they're not all inside yet, but lots of them are. And being the oldest museum, our buildings are the oldest as well, and we're having to devote a lot of resources to renewing the buildings. This is the end of our line. So if you go a few kilometers out our line, about 5 kilometers in total, you come to this loop which we put in, and the cars can be turned here and run back. But it's called Talbot Park. The Talbot family gave us the land and park because trolley systems in this country, as I'm sure most of you know, built amusement parks of various types at along their line, so that on weekends they could make some money by charging fares to go to the park, and that's what we're trying to honor there. There at the back of the loop is a Toronto Peterwit, and this is our main line, the way it looks for much of it. This, by the way, was taken in early October, and our area is famous then for the colors. You can see how the leaves are changing from green to red and yellow and so forth. And the steel structures there that hold up the trolley wire, the catenary, are from a real interurban line that was abandoned in New York State and just left them standing for years. And we went and retrieved them. So this looks very much like the right-of-way of a typical American interurban line would look. Now, this is our shop. It's called the Donald G. Curry Townhouse Shop. Donald Curry was an incredible person. He started working at the museum in 1953. He was a school teacher, so he had summers off and worked there, and later on worked weekends as well, and kept the restoration program going and became an expert in the industry in the U.S. of the trolley museum at all the conferences and conventions. He was known as an expert. So this building, as I say, this is where the restoration work goes on. The large central area is where the cars are that are being worked on. And over on this side, on 2 stories, 2 different levels, are all the machinery that needed to do woodwork and steel work and electrical work and so forth on the cars. Now, the type of thing you'll frequently see going on in there is somebody fabricating a missing piece of a car. So that's a partition from an earlier wooden car. This one is making seats, making the cushions of seats. The seats in American trams had 2 types of springs rather. One is those the tapered coils, and the other is the piece across the bottom. And as the seat goes together, those are placed upside down from what you see there into the frame as she is doing. Then canvas goes on, and then the rattan, it's called, that most of them had. Some of them had leather. The controllers, that's a K controller, require a lot of attention because they have 600 volts that goes through them. So there tend to be arcs that can cause damage. And there's a lot of steel work and machining going on. Here's one of our employees working on a Bridgeport machine. Now, this is a little glimpse of one of our cars, a Wheeling, West Virginia curbside car, which came as a stripped body in along about 1958, I think it was. And it was built by the Cincinnati Car Company, who had a unique way of building the cars. They think it was unique. They made the entire side of the car as a steel assembly, then made another one for the other side, turned them around and connected them together. So we did the same thing. It was so badly rusted out, we had to replace the steel. But you can see that this structure is some distance from the old car body. It's just in there, and it's about to be brought over and connected and then turned around the other side done. The result of that, believe it or not, over a 30-year period, it wasn't worked on constantly, but the entire project took about 30 years. There's the car in its finished condition. Another car getting a similar amount of work is this very handsome interurban car that ran between Portland and Lewiston, which are two of the largest cities in the state of Maine. And it was the finest interurban that Maine had, built to a very high standard. And they got cars that were the classic interurban design, mostly wooden or wooden steel composite in some places. And that car was a lot of pride for the people who operated those cars, because they were just about the shiniest thing that was around. We've been doing a lot of work on that car over the year. You can see here the framework being renewed and at the end of the car. And down here, that car had what we call stained glass in the roof sections, the clerestory sections. And stained glass is something where many different pieces of glass of different colors are connected by lead, molten lead, which then solidifies to make the windows in. This gentleman did, I think, all of the windows for the car. And you can see where the windows would go. But this is the view of the thing as it's torn apart. It's going back together now slowly, but very intricate work on all of the pieces. Now in the shop, we have a visitors gallery, as you can see on the left, so that anyone who's a visitor at the museum can come in, go up there, and take a look at the projects that are underway. It's two levels, one level where those visitors are standing, and then a higher level where I'm standing to take that picture. But you can see the interurban car on the right is in a slightly different state, but it's very easy for them to follow what's going on. And this is Seth Reed, one of or he's actually our best woodworker, a very skilled gentleman. He's putting together seats from an open car that need to be repaired. If there were new pieces needed, he would simply fabricate them. But that's extra work. The shop machinery is used by other departments as well. Here's a case of our track department building a connection from T-rails, Vignoles rail, to some flat rail, which you don't see here, sometimes called tram rail, to make a special compromise joint that will go into the front of a car barn. Now, South Boston 2 Car House will tell you a little bit about this. Between 1953 and 1956, our members with volunteer labor built this building with a lot of used telephone poles and other way. They didn't have any money at the time to do anything fancy. And then they built it. It had no sides, had roof but no sides, and it never had doors. Could almost take 6 cars with the ends sticking out. The track in front of it, another picture in a minute, is a distinctive type of track used in Boston. It was put down new by the Transit Authority in Boston after World War II, when they put PCCs in that part of the city, and they needed to be able to run them through the buildings and needed some more track. There's the type of track again. So we were thinking, well, we had a grant to replace the building, and we wanted to use that track again. So if you look down here at the bottom of this picture, there is that track, what's left of it. You can see the ties are still there, and the old building was here. We moved and measured so we could fit a wider and longer building. And to do that, we had to move it to the right to do that. But there's the frame going in, the foundation, and there's the building when it's complete. And this is just about a year ago it was completed. Inside is insulated, though not fully heated. We have some beginning heat, so some work can go on in there in the winter. The winters in Maine are very cold, by the way, so that makes it difficult to do outdoor activities in the winter. The car on the right is a smaller interurban car. It came from the state of New Hampshire, ran between Manchester and Nashua, 2 cities in New Haven. In New Hampshire, sorry. And the little car in the corner behind it is from Nagasaki, Japan. And it's sitting on a Brill truck from Philadelphia. In those days, that type of equipment was exported in that direction, not necessarily the other direction. Now, this building is designed for multiple activities. This black area here is sections of grate work, which can be steel work, which can be pulled out and stacked aside. And underneath it is a pit, an inspection pit, so you can get underneath the car and work on it. But when you're going to use the building for another activity, you can put those things back in. And then notice here, there's a smooth surface where the flange would go of the wheel. And that's because it's designed so you can take pieces like this, stick them in next to the rail, and then you have a very useful surface. I happened to see those at Oklahoma City when I was with the committee visiting the new streetcar shop there. And they had that arrangement. We said, that's just what we need. So we copied it. Model railroad building. This is something that's new for us. That was quite unexpected that happened way up in northern Maine, near the Canadian border. It's about a 4-hour drive from where we are. There was a couple, a man and a woman, who had spent years and years building a model railroad of the Maine Central Road, which was not a tram line. It was a railroad line that served the state and did so for many years. The founders could not continue. They became ill and passed away. And a friend of theirs, that would be a wealthy Swiss gentleman, helped them find a place where the railroad could go to save it. They contacted me through a mutual friend, and we agreed to take the thing. The Swiss gentleman agreed to give us a grant to build the thing, and that we did. And Maine is famous for what's called its rock-bound coast, which is along the water. There's big pieces of rock sticking out everywhere, and it goes inland as well, as we found a couple of times in our history. But we were trying to build the foundation for this and ran into a tremendous amount of rock. They had to spend several weeks using special tools to get that out. But finally, they did get it out. The foundation went in, and the building has proceeded, and that's it, finished. Now, to move the railroad from northern Maine was a big job. It turns out there's a company that specializes in moving model railroads. So we got them. It was stored over the winter while we finished the interior of the building, and they have it covered in plastic while the work is going on to prevent the dust. And there's areas where the thing is expanding, because up in northern Maine, they had built the aisles, the areas where people could walk, very narrow, and you can't do that on new construction. You have to have wider space for safety reasons. So there are places where we cut the railroad and moved it apart, and so now we have quite an enthusiastic group who are working on improving that. And this has turned out to be a big draw, bringing people in. So you can see kids love it, and bit by bit it became uncovered and became functional. So we hired a new manager for this facility, an instructor, and he is giving guidance to these visitors. So it's been a really nice thing for us to have. And it allows us to have part of our operation open year round, because this is an ordinary heated building, and people can come in the winter. We're just getting our first experience with that, and it seems to be working, that people are coming to see the thing. So that helps us. Other buildings around the museum, we're very dependent on big cranes and trucks of various types to keep our property up and whatnot. And we had no place where people could work on the trucks, and it'd be awful in the winter or in wet weather to work on them in the open. So this building has gone up to be used with no tracks, just by work trucks and cranes and the occasional bus. Ooh. One of our older buildings, we expanded, we made it wider by the amount you can see on the left, and we extended it out, made it a longer building than it was. And this is the new construction a couple of years ago as we were doing that. The old part of the building needs some help. It's showing its age, and we're now raising money to try to be able to improve that building as well. Another vital piece for us in the structure is our parts warehouse. You can't see how long this is, but it is a fairly long building. and it's packed from floor to ceiling with parts to keep cars going. That's, in theory, we want to run our cars forever, and we don't have an endless supply, but we have a good supply. It's not just in this building. There's a number of storage containers which have more stuff in it. The problem is getting to know all the things you have and documenting them properly, because there are many parts. Our operation for visitors, of course, is a very principal part of the museum. Most museums in the U.S., well, let me say this, first. Most museums in the U.S. do not receive federal or state government funding. There are some that do, but general history museums like us, rail museums of different types. So they've got to make the money on their own. So money, in our case, comes from our members and donors, people who want to support it. They can give small amounts or large amounts. And the other is from income that comes from the admission charges that are charged to people and are paid by the people who come to see us, and the special event tickets that we sell as well. These cars, these open side cars, are of course extremely popular in the summertime. It's amazing that these cars exist. Just our original car 31, it was amazing that it existed in 1939. But in New Haven, Connecticut, where most cities that had cars like this had gotten rid of them by about 1920, 1925, New Haven kept a building full of these cars because Yale University is located there. And many people would come to their football games in the fall, and they would run these cars from the train station in New Haven to the Yale football stadium. But there's many pictures that show these cars with people hanging on the side, hanging on the roof, and huge numbers of people would be moved. But in 1948, that ended. The streetcar service ended in New Haven, Connecticut. And fortunately, we were able to get 4 of these cars at that time. These 2 are used more regularly, particularly the one in the background there. There's another one, a similar one, which is used occasionally, and there's one unrestored, so it should keep that going for years. Here's another one, came from the same company, the Connecticut company. And the streetcars in Connecticut were consolidated, almost all of them, into one company, which was unique. No other state that I believe did that. So that's how these things are called Connecticut cars rather than New Haven cars or Hartford cars. This one is recently restored and is used regularly in our operation. This car, which came from the Eastern Massachusetts Street Railway, which ran north of Boston and south of Boston, but not in Boston. Another company had that. This car ran until 1946 when it came to the museum. And that's what's called a semi-convertible. It's one of the original types of semi-convertible. And here's another view of it. The open cars were popular with people, but of course it was expensive for the trolley companies to have one set of cars for summer and one set for winter. So the idea of combining them came up. So first there were convertible cars, which is not like this one, where they would have a panel that goes all the way down here. It can be taken out in the summertime and put it in the winter. And then the next idea to avoid having to store all these was to come up with a car like this, where part of the window would slide down and part of it would slide up to the roof. So you would have a big open area. So that's why they're called semi-convertible. Convertibles were ones where you could take the whole panel out, and semi-convertibles were ones where you had windows. And that became a very popular type of car in the US, the semi-convertibles. Here's the wheeling curbside again. This was developed by the Cincinnati Car Company in Ohio at a time in the 1920s when budgets were starting to get tight for streetcar systems. They needed to save money on electricity, save money on track maintenance. So this was built as a lightweight car, and it was made light in the sides here by curving the steel panels. That way the panels could be thinner than they would be otherwise, but they become very strong. And there were over 400 of these cars on a couple of dozen systems throughout the Midwest. This city had 20 of them, if I recall correctly, and other cities had a few here and there. They were so common in this configuration, they were called rubber stamp trolleys, as if you stamped one, then stamped another and stamped them. But this is the only one which has been preserved and is operable.
Amerika ist ganz so wichtig.
Now, for the public, it's very important that we have a good interface, and we're just so fortunate to have so many willing volunteers. All these gentlemen are volunteers. They all operate the cars and give speeches and answer questions for the visitors in there. Without them, we wouldn't be able to do much of anything. We have a thorough training program they go through for safety reasons and also learning historical facts. Every year, usually in the summertime, we have a night photograph, a night photo shoot where people pose photographs and floodlight them and get really interesting things like this. These cars are all near to my heart. I like them because I was the project leader in all of them. But the one in the middle is this particular one of interest to me, and it's from Washington, D.C. I grew up in New York State in a place that had gotten rid of its streetcars when I was 3 years old. But we had family in Washington, and we traveled there almost every year. And I looked forward to riding the streetcars because these very well-maintained PCCs were running all over the city, and it was really something to see. Here's another nighttime view, a couple of Connecticut cars, and this tower, Tower C. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. And here's a view from the early part of the last century, showing the Manchester, New Hampshire's City of Manchester car. It was called. The directors of the Manchester Street Railway decided they needed something for inspecting lines. They built this car and used it themselves, and also sent it out on charters for family gatherings or church gatherings or what have you. When the thing was taken out of service and streetcars abandoned, the body of this car went into a backyard where it was a child's playhouse, and it was rescued by our people, who then did our first major restoration and recreation. And here's the car as it looks now and gets used in our service. And there it is from up above as well. And here is a picture which probably could have been taken in 1905 without anything looking out of place, because it's all the appropriate streetcar and the appropriate clothing for that particular thing. The interior of the city of Manchester, it just got completely rebuilt furniture this year, or last year rather, so that looks nice. Now, again, our theme of getting the major streetcar types in from big cities. These are two major Midwestern cities in the U.S. The one on the left is the Twin Cities, which are the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul that are very close to each other in Minnesota. And on the right is Cleveland, Ohio center entrance car. And another picture of it here. You can see that the people could enter and leave only on that. They're big cars. Cleveland was a city that probably could have had a subway like some of the other cities did, but didn't. So they had a very intense streetcar system with big cars. And this pulled trailers that look just like it. We have one of them that's been mostly restored, but not completely. And we look forward to having a two-car train operating at some point in the future. Philadelphia has always had things of traction interest, and one is the so-called Red Arrow lines that ran out of 69th Street at the end of the elevated, the western side of Philadelphia, on out to several suburbs. And this car was one of the earlier type cars, the center entrance cars. It would run in two-car trains sometimes, but when the private company was selling out to the transit authority, the municipal transit authority, which happened pretty much throughout the United States, where a government agency took over. When he did that, the owner had this car restored, and then gave it to us after they had done the celebrations of the last private rides. This is a classic big city streetcar from Chicago. They're called Red Rattler, was what the fans would call them, because they were a little bit in the noisy side. But they were big cars and fast cars, and they could move people in and out quickly over the large platforms they had. And you can see why. If you look at that little picture down in the lower right, that's what State Street in Chicago looked like when cars like this were in service. And many people got moved in these cars. Whoops, okay. This, many of you will recognize as a New Orleans car, the type that's still running there. In fact, that's car 966. Car 965 and 967 are still in regular service every day in New Orleans. We got the car from somebody in Alabama that had left it sitting outside, and it had been badly vandalized. There wasn't a stick of wood inside. All the windows were gone, everything. And with sponsorship from our donors, our member donors, we restored the car completely and put it back into service. Now here it's running, but it's not at our museum. It's at the Lowell National Historical Park in Lowell, Massachusetts. Lowell, Massachusetts is about 120 kilometers from our museum, and it's about 55 kilometers northwest of Boston. When that park was built in the 1980s, they're commemorating the mills where the women worked making cloth fabrics of different types. They all rode the streetcars to get to work every day. And so when the park was created, they felt it was important to have streetcars providing rides in there to capture that part of history. So they had two open cars. You can see one on the right and one, you just see a little piece of it down there on the left, and then a closed car as well here. So those three cars belong to the national park. We brought our car down because we were working with them on a plan to expand the museum and to actually create a streetcar line through the city of Lowell, the downtown city, a longer streetcar line than this operates on. And we had the car there for 21 years. The plans are changed, so that didn't happen. But our volunteers were operating the car intermixed with the park, and the park paid employees. We just brought the car back to Maine a couple of months ago because it's been there for 21 years and it needs a little more maintenance than could be done in the limited shop there. So after we've done the maintenance, we may send it back down there. Now, everything we've been looking at so far is electric traction. Here's horse traction. There are relatively few horse trams that survived into modern times. And we are very fortunate to get one from the Union Street Railway Company, which was in New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is on the south coast of Mass. So it was brought out for a special occasion to recreate what history was like. And the car's recreating it. The horse wasn't happy about the idea at all. But his trainer managed to lead him along there and get to give a few people a ride. The interurban collection, we have interurbans from a number of places. I think most of you know it was fairly common in the United States for cities that had streetcars also to have an interurban line that will run out to the suburbs or to another city. And sometimes in open competition with steam railroads. This is a typical interurban car and a typical express car, they're called, if we're hauling baggage. It's from the Montreal and Southern counties, so it's across the border in Quebec from where we are. They ran across the bridge over the St. Lawrence River and into the southern counties south of Montreal. And they ran frequently in trains with multiple passenger cars and multiple freight cars. And so it was quite an impressive operation. Perhaps the most famous interurban in the U.S. was called the Chicago, North Shore, and Milwaukee, North Shore for short. They ran into downtown Chicago on the elevated. If you look carefully, you can see there's a third rail shoe there. So the trolley poles were down and they were powered by the third rail. And they ran in large trains, a varying number, it could be 6 or 7 cars in there, each with a conductor. And each with the conductor raising and lowering that trolley pole under speed at going, 50, 60 miles an hour, while it could be raining or snowing into their face. They would stand between the cars and raise and lower the poles. We have 3 of the cars, one of which used to be a diner, and one of which used to be an observation car. And they're impressive cars. West out of Chicago was the Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin. And they had cars like this, big solid steel cars. And they also ran into the elevated down to the loop, it's called in downtown Chicago, the loop of the elevated. So you had cars coming from both the west and the north into downtown Chicago. It was quite an active place on the elevated structure. The the interurban industry really started to suffer by the late 1920s because buses were coming that could actually carry a few people in them, and automobile ownership was starting to rise. So it was harder and harder for them to keep business. So they tried the idea of having some high-speed competition that could fight back. So cars like this were developed around 1930, 1931. And the one on the left, number 118, came from Cincinnati and Lake Erie. They had developed the car and bought them and ran them, but only were able to run them for a few years before they too found themselves in financial difficulty. So they sold this car and a few others to something called the Cedar Rapids in Iowa City in the state of Iowa. That was shortened to Krandic, and so that's known as a Krandic car. And the one on the right, I say, was in Indiana initially, but ran into the same problems. It had been converted to a parlor car. It was sold to the line, another line that ran west out of Philadelphia up to Allentown. We saw that red car that ran west to some shorter distances. But this car on the right had the parlor set up, put in again, and we've got it now in that way. And it ran until 1951, so it had a little bit more success when it was put back into service. The interesting thing is these two cars look pretty much alike, but they were built by different companies, so they were about a year apart from one another. Interesting. Rapid Transit Metro collection we have as well. In the United States, before World War II, there were only 4 cities that had what we call a true rapid transit metro type of system, completely grade separated and with high level platform boarding, as you can see in this car. Boston was one of those 4 cities. Cars like that, we have one of those cars in our collection. New York City followed Boston a couple of years, and Boston's was the first subway, and then New York came. And incidentally, there's a New York Transit Museum in Brooklyn, which has cars of this exact type, R1, R9. They are running a restored pair of them on the subway in New York now between Thanksgiving and Christmas. And a lot of people go down there just to ride those things. Philadelphia had these Art Deco cars that ran across to New Jersey. And Chicago had these converted PCC cars that ran on the L downtown. There is our most modern rapid transit train. It came from Boston, where it ran on the Blue Line, and was built in the 80s. And here's our oldest subway car, the Budapest Foldolati car, that was made really, really low because when they built the tunnel, they had to squeeze over a water main and under a street, and didn't have the time or money to relocate the water main. So there is the one we have. It made its way back across the Atlantic, was built about 1895. So it was an early car, and they ran until it was into the 80s, I believe, 70s or 80s. They ran in service. They had a huge, long service life. International collection, the Budapest car, of course, is international, but here's the one that referenced before we got started here. There, and that's the car that we have from Rome. On the top photo, all the employees from the shop came out to see this American who was going to take the car away. So that's why they posed for the picture. And there's how it looks now in Maine. We can't really run the car at the current time. We need some work. The track gauge that we have, of course, is 1435 millimeters, which is the standard gauge. Many Italian systems were 1445 millimeter gauge, and that's just enough to throw it off and to derail it occasionally. When the Milan cars went to San Francisco, they regauged them to get from 1445 to 1435. And Carl Johnson, who's on this call, worked for Muni at the time, I think was involved in that activity as the cars were prepared. One of the 4 double-deckers we have, this one from Glasgow, it's called the Glasgow Coronation. It's being unloaded in Boston from a ship onto our trailer, where it would then spend about 2 days getting its way up to Maine, because it's very hard to move something that high over the road. Here's the Blackpool standard car, one of the 144 coming in with the same crane that was in the last picture, but now you can see it. That's called the McKee lighter, and it was a feature on the Boston waterfront for many, many years. You would see it unloading things. So it's just the strangest thing to see this house on a barge coming with a heavy load of whatever it was, even a tram car occasionally. And so it unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. I don't know when it went out of service, but we stopped seeing it. Interestingly enough, there's an aircraft carrier over in the Boston Naval Yard. And there's 144 at the museum. Toronto, as I think most of you will recognize that. That is a Canadian light rail vehicle. That's number 4068, which is the one that we have acquired and came to the museum recently. It's on Spadina. Spadina was a busy crosstown route that was bit by bit abandoned years ago when they were getting rid of streetcars. But they relatively recently, maybe 15 years ago, put it back, and now it carries huge numbers of people. And so you can see the cars that are in service there. Their 4068 was being loaded onto a trailer, and it didn't come straight to Maine. It went to the local museum in Ontario, which if you get a chance to go to Toronto and go outside of Toronto to the Halton County Radial Railroad, the museum, they have a really nice collection of a Montreal car and a few others. We sent it there because Toronto's track gauge. It's another one that's different. It's about 35 millimeters wider than standard. And the Illinois Railway Museum is getting one of these cars as well. And the plan was to have both of them stay in Ontario and be regauged. But unfortunately, that fell through. So subsequently, we moved the car down and put it on temporary track at our museum, and it will it'll get regauged in the next year or two. They're a very common sight in downtown Toronto. They're very nice riding cars if you haven't been on. Also from Toronto by a circuitous route is something that services the weather. That car was built for the Eastern Massachusetts Street Railway, which we had seen a car from earlier, was sold secondhand to New York Railways, I think it was, down near New York City, and then sold third hand to Toronto, where they say they had quite a large fleet of these things and kept them for many years until they gave up with the snow sweeping. And we got that car, and it's since been put back in the Eastern Mass paid scheme. And also from north of the border is one of our favorite, certainly one of my favorite cars, and that's the Montreal Golden Chariot Chariot d'Or. It was one of 4 such cars that Montreal had. It was built about 1906 and provided tour service around the city of Montreal until 1958. It's just a pleasure to ride on. It's a quiet, smooth riding car. And there's something nice about being up there a little bit and doing that. And in the winter at our Christmas prelude events, which just concluded 2 days ago, in prior years, we would sell rides on this car. And Santa Claus would be on the car to greet the kids. But people sold out the tickets. It could be a very, very freezing cold day in Maine. And they still rode this thing. Now, we've done much work in this car, but unfortunately, the wheels were made out of cast iron. Cast iron is something that it becomes over time very brittle. It's subject to breaking. And we found that there are cracks in the wheels on that car. So it's very dangerous to run it because the wheel could fall apart. So we're raising money to replace it with steel wheels and do some other maintenance work. We're going to send it out to a shop, but we estimate it's going to cost around $100,000. We've raised $50,000 so far to that. So we're hoping the project will start later this year, or later next year, actually. Also from Canada, but an American type, excuse me, is this Baldwin Westinghouse locomotive. It's called Baldwin Westinghouse because it's a joint venture of those 2 companies. You may know the name Baldwin from steam engines in North America, and Westinghouse, of course, is the electrical component of these things. This was a standard design that many urban lines had in the U.S. This one came from Oshawa, Ontario. You can see it's OR for Oshawa Railways, car number 300. Oshawa is located on the north side of Lake Ontario between Toronto and Montreal. And that's been a very useful car, sorry, for our museum, because it's very powerful, yet can operate very slowly. So for moving delicate things, it's great. An earlier version of that is this, a wooden version, car number 100, the Atlantic Shoreline right-of-way. I mentioned earlier that our track is laid on the right-of-way of a former interurban line, and that was at the Atlantic Shoreline. This car mostly operated, this locomotive operated at sort of a 90-degree angle from the ocean into a mill town called Sanford in town. And it hauled these big cars full of coal. The amazing thing about it is it is all wooden. So the beams, the structural beams that hold it together and carry the load are, you can see how tall they are, because right where it says Atlantic Shore Line Railway, that's the height. And there's a series of them that go across it. It's very hard to find lumber like that to replace it. So in the rebuilding, we had to do some searching to get that. That is one of the rare times that we got some government money to help us with restoring that locomotive. And this little locomotive on the right, number 150, is a recent acquisition. It's a diesel, but it's very convenient for our yard crew to use to move cars around, especially ones that can't operate or places where there's no trolley wire. And our network of track is large enough and buildings large enough that moving cars is a challenge when you have to make a change. And these gentlemen are our yard crew, and they're the experts in how you use those locomotives to move all those cars and meet the objectives. It's a good crew. Now, activities and special events for visitors. I mentioned that we have to get a lot of our money from admissions, and we do. And what we do, and you'll find this in art museums and everything, is we have special events that are designed to attract people, particularly kids. We're hoping that some of them will grow up to be interested in trolleys and work on them, become members. So different people of note to the kids come. This is a Red Dog's a TV star in the US for children's programs. If you've ever watched old American Western movies, there were often scenes where somebody was trying to get away and there was a railroad track and they hopped onto one of these things and pumped their way out of the danger. And kids love it even today. So it's one of our members watching carefully as the kids, for a premium fare, have gotten to pump the car up and down and goes down the track. And something that's about as new, it's interesting, it's sort of been sweeping the country. It's something called rail bikes. And as you can see in that picture in the upper left, there are the orange wheels. So those are in fact a type of plastic. The silver frame is aluminium. And they have built these lightweight cars with pedals so that you can sit in that so-called recumbent position and pedal your way out the line. So we allow these things to run between streetcar trips. So a streetcar go out, and then one of these will go out, and then a streetcar trip. Being very careful of safety, because you don't want a streetcar to run into one of these things. And it's very interesting. It's become quite popular. Other museums have, and railroads have these as well. But we find it brings a whole bunch of people to the museum who get here and say, "Joy, we never knew this was here," referring to the museum. We'll come back or stay and spend money in doing it. So we've had a pretty good reaction to this. This year is the first full year we did it after starting last year, and we're satisfied with the results. A lot of events happen in the autumn in the United States in preparation for the Halloween holiday, which is about a lot of being scared and doing running tricks on people and so forth. But with that time of year, pumpkin patch, comes the appearance of these big gourds that are quite popular for playing with or for making pies or other food. And what we do is they grow, sort of a hand grow, out in this field along our line. And the kids, for the price of a special ticket, can ride out on the trolley, go down, pick out their pumpkin, and take it with them as they leave. So that's an event that we run. Weddings are becoming somewhat popular. We have a number of them each year. There's one of the lovely couple on the Connecticut car, 1160. And look at the dress there. It's a good thing the stairway was there to this tower. So we have that event. Something I don't have pictures of is the winter show called Christmas Prelude. Our town, Kennebunkport, developed this some years ago to encourage people to come and shop there in the winter. We've joined in, and we have events in the winter. And this year, over 2 weekends, this fall, we had 5,900 people. 3,900 people rather, who came and went through the thing, and we made something like $50,000 on it. So it was a successful venture. The weather cooperated. While we're at it, let me just point this building out. You've seen it in a couple of slides. This is called Tower C. It came from the elevated line in Boston, the elevated above the street. It was located at a three-way junction where 3 lines came together. And from the upper level, there were levers that went out to the points, the switches, and moved them back and forth. So depending on where a train was going, it would send it in the right direction. When the elevated closed, it became redundant. It was located right at Boston Harbor, and so it was lowered onto a barge and taken to Maine, where unfortunately we had to cut it in half. You could just actually see the saw cuts right there. And bring it the last couple of miles to the museum from the harbor. But we've been developing exhibits inside it. The second floor is being renovated now, and we're planning to have more exhibits with that stairway to get people up to it. Another large acquisition that came from another place in the Boston Elevated was this. This was a station head house called Northampton Station. There was a platform that came out of the right there and went out between the tracks. This one also came up by sea and also had to be cut in half. We're trying to figure out good ways of reuse, what to do with it. But it's all copper clad. It's designed by a famous architect in Boston. All these stations were, and that's the one that was saved. Our infrastructure is also greatly supported by our track department, who built almost all the track we have. It's been done by volunteers. Only in the last couple of years have we been able to hire some track companies to come in and help us. But this was when the outer loop, the Talbot Park loop, was being laid out. It was very precisely done, bending all the rail. Some of it came from a temporary loop that Boston had installed when they rebuilt one of their lines. The equipment in the middle there, the middle picture, is called a tamper, and that reaches down and shoves ballast, shoves stone beneath the ties so that you can level the track properly. And it's a very old machine, but very useful, although it needs lots of maintenance. Here our track crew is fabricating or assembling a switch, you could really say. It's in front of the shop, and the shop track has to be kept clear so cars can come and go. So when the shop tracks became so worn out, we put the switch together here, then used a crane to pick it up and drop it into position in front of the shop, and that saved, a lot of work, made a lot of work possible that wouldn't have been otherwise. Sometimes we use the modern tools, and they really help out. So here's a modern truck that's on the rails, and it's on, we call it high rail when a truck goes onto the rails, and you can see there's a bucket up there with our overhead manager is working on the trolley wire up there. But other times the classic situation works out best. And this is about 120 years older than the truck you just saw. And this is a line car from a city in New Hampshire that still can do its job, even if you have to crank the thing manually up and down the platform. But it does in fact work. Other collections, we've really focused on the trams and interurbans. Library and archives, trackless trolleys, and buses. I'll just touch on those briefly. This is where our library material is. We have a huge amount of information that came from the whole trolley industry. It can't really be dealt with adequately inside a house. So we've been studying what we can do. This is a design created by an architect that we would love to build, but I'm afraid we're not going to be able to afford it. The prices came in much too high. But it's the idea, if we build, we're trying to figure out if we build part of it and use that, or not, but we've got to get an adequate structure to protect that material. Trackless trolleys, we have a selection of trackless trolleys. Most of the major manufacturers are represented. The one on the right is a build from Johnstown, Pennsylvania, then a Boston one, two Boston ones actually, one from Edmonton, Alberta in Canada. And this is just a little demonstration wire we had. Our hope is to build a line where these two things can be run regularly for our visitors. About 2 years ago, Boston got rid of its trolleybus system. It had once been the second largest trolleybus system in the country. Just there were wires everywhere. The last type of vehicles they purchased were these. Note there's a left-hand door, which is very unusual in the United States for a bus, but there were platforms in some of the stations that were only on the left. And this was an enthusiast trip, a fan trip, shortly before the lines were abandoned. The one behind it is a dual mode one, which was used to get to the new tunnel over to the airport. Those have all been gone, and this one has been saved. And there it is, arriving in Maine. It was towed up and on display. Buses we have a lot of too. They date from early models like this, which recently was painted to make it look good, and they stretch up through more modern things. These were just about in every city in the US for many years. Now, I'm going to change gears here in the last few minutes, show you something that's a little different. With our natural collection, we thought we ought to look at cars that are in our collection that came from systems that are completely abandoned streetcars, which is most of them, except for places like Philadelphia and San Francisco, and have now returned to urban rail. That is, the city has built streetcars or light rail. And we have a car from the city that sort of goes between the old and the new, if you will. So this is Dallas, Texas. They bought double-end PCC cars, all of which were later sent to Boston, but which ran there until about 1956. And they had another Boston connection. These are called Stone and Webster standard cars. That's called a turtleback roof. And they operated throughout the city as well. But by 1956, it was all gone. We got this car out of service then as to represent Dallas. And then an enthusiast line started when some track was uncovered, and they found the body of one of these cars and rebuilt it. And that line has now become very successful, running through this nice neighborhood in Dallas. And one of the recent things they did is build a turntable so that cars could be turned, the ones that needed it or didn't. This is a Melbourne car they own on the turntable, where there's a link to a light rail subway very close by. This is what Dallas has for light rail. These huge long trains that could just about, they can't make them any longer because they would cut off a street every time they stop because they're longer than a block. And here's what was the interurban out to Plano has been put back again, but with these cars running. And on top of that, they have a modern streetcar, which may get connected to the Heritage streetcar, but hasn't yet. That's their main railroad station. And here's this little brick-rail car stops there. You can see the trolley wire goes left. The track where I'm standing continues. The cars go battery powered over this bridge. Another city, Denver, had these rather unusual cars for years, but their system was abandoned relatively early. One of them was saved to be a light rail state, but they were also served by something called the Denver and South Platte, came out of one southern end of the city. And they had Birdie cars, which were later sold to our trolley liner here years ago. They only ever had two, that company. We have both of them, so it's kind of amusing. We have their all-time roster. But Denver has moved forward to light rail, and they have an extensive light rail system that's they've been talking about expanding, but it circulates through downtown and does a lot. Washington, D.C. had these cars in addition to PCC I showed you earlier. Note there's no trolley poles on it because they got power from underneath the way New York and London and Paris did. And you can see some of the cars in this scene have no trolley poles, and some of them have trolley poles. It depends on where they're going. So outside of the Federal District, they have to use the poles. There's our PCC restored again. It actually has one of the conduit plows inside as a little display. Washington, after getting rid of everything in 1962, came back with the metro, and then with a modern streetcar line, which is kind of a really badly mismanaged project that may prevent any more from happening. But this one line they did build is somewhat successful, and it's being extended to a metro station. This was the opening day of that line in February morning a couple of years ago. There's more stories to tell about this line. It's amazing they got it going, but it is running. Moving to the West Coast, Los Angeles is well known for the different types of cars it had. This is called the Huntington Standard. They had the California arrangement, it was called, where the windows are open in the end and closed in the center and open at the back. And we got one of those. And so there's the McKee's lighter again, picking it up. This car went through the Panama Canal. It may have been the first tram ever to go through the Panama Canal to come to Boston and into Seashore. And of course, there was the huge Pacific Electric line, which ran throughout the LA Basin area, which they foolishly threw away and are now spending billions rebuilding. This is our car. Ours is the only Pacific Electric car outside of California. But one of the places they're redoing it, if you know LA at all, Santa Monica is the beach to the west of downtown. And it used to be the Santa Monica airline ran out there with traditional cars. And now this type and this type of car are running out on that line. It's very nice, but it was just a shame they had to recreate it. And they've been talking for years about doing a streetcar line and coming to our streetcar committee meetings. They're still planning to do it. Light blue would be the streetcar line. The other colors are the underground light rail and metro, which they have built. So we'll see what happens. One came just meeting a couple of weeks ago, and so they're still working on it. Kansas City, a city in the middle of the country, had cars like this and like this. The PCCs, when they abandoned them prematurely in 1956, were sent to Canada, to Mexico, and elsewhere in the United States. They were good cars. Then nothing was there for years until this new modern line downtown, the circulator, got built, which has been very successful. They're now expanding it to a line, a place about 5 kilometers further south than where it is today. And it's this is one of our committee meetings there with the new train. The track ended there, but now it's being extended down. This is at the Union Station, extended to the south to a university. We have one of the car bodies and one of those PCCs as well. Milwaukee, in addition to having the Chicago North Shore and Milwaukee interurban line, had streetcars. There's the one we got after it was abandoned in 1958. After the North Shore went on in 1962, there was nothing. But then they came up with a modern streetcar line, which has been developed there as well, and running right in mixed traffic through downtown. This looks a bit like Amsterdam. It's a drawbridge. Atlanta had cars of this type, and we have the body of an Atlanta car, just as we have the body of the Kansas City car. Atlanta once had an intense system of streetcars and trolley buses, but abandoned it fairly early compared to others. They never bought PCCs. Now they have a downtown circulator, which with these nice Siemens cars running on it. There's a circular path around downtown Atlanta, and they want to put track in it all the way around. This was starter line was built to sort of prove the idea, but it will move out to the extension. We hope that's their planning, and there it is going past. I'm sure most of you have heard of the civil rights leader, Dr. Martin Luther King. He was from Atlanta, and he was the reverend at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, and that is the Ebenezer Baptist Church. So the modern trams go right past to Dr. King's location. Minneapolis, St. Paul, the Twin Cities, they had distinctive cars that were built in the Minneapolis shops. So there you see a couple of them. They were very wide cars, large cars, and unique features. We have one of them. I've done a lot of restoration work on it. Excuse me. And they're called gate cars. So you can see those gates at the back. They were designed for people to get in and out quickly, and the gates could be open or closed just to speed things along. This is what's running in Minneapolis now. It's much newer than the streetcar lines were abandoned in the 50s. And it's been successful. They reach in several directions. St. Paul, one of the directions they go is over to St. Paul, and you see them right in downtown there as well. Going down under, the Sydney P-Class tram. We got one years ago. It's a nice car, very British influence in the design. And they got rid of the trams entirely about the time we got that car in the late 50s. And now they're bringing them back. Their sister city, Melbourne, has got, as most of you know, the largest tram system in the world. But Sydney is slowly working, catching up. They never will, but I mean, they're slowly implementing trams. And so there's one of their new lines. Some of them have the ATTS system where they draw power from underground, or from the surface rather. And I throw this picture in here too, not just to show off the landmark of Sydney, the Opera House, but to say that's where our car 1700 lived, because before the Opera House was there, the car barn was there, and streetcars were there. St. Louis is a city that had a lot of PCCs. We have one of those things awaiting some restoration. There they were throughout downtown until 1966, but they, after 66, had nothing until the light rail came, and it's also been a successful system. It runs out to the airport, so it's quite convenient, runs over into Illinois, and also stops obviously at Union Station, as you can see. They have a little heritage line using cars that were replica cars built for Portland, Oregon, but a couple of them were freed up to come down to St. Louis. They've got all kinds of money problems, and they're now closed down for the winter, but they have built this little line separate from the light rail that goes through an entertainment district. Cincinnati was known for having positive and negative trolley wires, like a trolley bus. As you can see there, there's two poles. We have the body of one of these cars, needs a lot of work, but it is preserved. But Cincinnati also has come back the modern streetcar. Even though the mayor fought like crazy to prevent it from being built, it was built, and they've decided not to charge a fare, and they've got a lot of riders. They're talking about expanding it. This was the opening day a couple of years ago of the streetcar, and there is where the lines cross. It's a figure 8, that's where they cross, and so that's that. This is Detroit. Detroit. It's another city that probably could have had a big metro, but it never did because the auto manufacturers were against it. You know, it's where the U.S. auto industry is centered, and nonetheless, there were streetcars, but they got rid of them a little earlier than they would have because of some of the pressure from the automobiles. Look at this thing crossing all those tracks. Imagine what that sounded like. But they are coming back. Detroit, you know, is a city that's had huge problems of all types. It's been bankrupt, but they're trying desperately to bring it back, and parts of downtown have been rehabbed and look nice. And they have built a trolley line that goes the length of Woodward Avenue, or quite a distance on Woodward Avenue, which was one of the last streetcar lines. And they're pleased with it. They're pleased with the reaction it's getting, and talking about building more. Baltimore, finally, that's actually our car. That was the car that ran in Baltimore up until the very late 50s. Also, there's a Peter Witt from Baltimore that we have. That's an interesting design. That was sort of the most modern design that Brill built, with one exception. There's somebody, could have been one of us some years ago. That's the same car, 6144, our car. And the PCCs, which ran there at the end in this dull colors. After the streetcars went out in 1963, many years passed, and then they started planning for light rail. They connected out to the airport and to an industrial area in the north, and they took over this street to do it. And it's another one that's been successful. They go right by, or within eyesight of the Baltimore Streetcar Museum, which I highly recommend to you if you haven't seen it. It's a small operation, but it's a very nice collection of cars and rides. And that's what I have to show you today. So we thank you for your interest in the Seashore Trolley Museum. There's our website. There's pictures of more cars in the fleet that I didn't show you in that slide. If you'd like to be a member to follow us what's happening on our website, you'll see there's a place where you can join. We have social media presence at Facebook and Instagram, and we welcome you to visit us in Maine. So thank you very much.